C-45, as before, dealing with cannabis and also amending the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts, and we're focusing on medical cannabis on both our panels today. And on this panel, I welcome James O'Hara, who is the Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana. Hilary Black, who is founder of the BC Compassion Club Society. And here is an individual whose name we've heard of before because we have one of his colleagues here before, Mr. Conroy. We have Kirk Tousaw, barrister of Tousaw Law Corporation. So welcome to all three of you. We've got till 1:15 on this panel. If I could ask each of you to give opening comments of up to 7 minutes, and then we'll have questions from my colleagues and I. So I'll start in the order that I have you on the list. Mr. O'Hara.
Thank you. Thank you, Senators, for the invitation to speak to you today. My name is James O'Hara, and I'm the President and CEO of Canadians for Fair Access to Medical Marijuana. Before I begin my remarks, I would just like to say this is a very special day for me. On this very day in 1974, Victoria Day, the 24th of May, I first arrived in Canada from Scotland as a wee lad. I want to take this opportunity to recognize and sincerely thank Canada and the Government of Canada for welcoming me to this country as of this day, my home now for 44 years. It is with humble gratitude I sit before you today and appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about how we can make this wonderful country even better.
Accent, though.
A little bit. CFAM is a national nonprofit organization which has successfully represented medical cannabis patients since 2014. With a membership of over 20,000 Canadians, the organization has emerged as a thoughtful, legitimate, grassroots voice for medical cannabis in the nonprofit advocacy space. I'm a former bank vice president, and for many years now, I've also been a medical cannabis patient. I have a number of conditions which I successfully treat using medical cannabis, including focal seizures, osteoarthritis, and chronic asthma. The use of medical cannabis in my life has been utterly life-changing, and I mean life-changing. I've been able to reduce the number of seizures I have by about 80 to 90%, and my overall quality of life has increased dramatically, and I am far from alone in my experience. It's with this thought in mind around the legalization of recreational cannabis in C-45 that it's important for us not to lose sight of the needs of patients. We have had a system of legalized medical cannabis in Canada for a number of years now, supporting patients with legitimate medical needs and who are treating their conditions and symptoms with the support of competent healthcare professionals. Now let me touch on some of the challenges. There are indeed challenges with the medical cannabis system, and a significant one is that many patients can't afford to get the medicine they need. As advocates for patients across the country, we want to make sure the government's move to legalize recreational cannabis doesn't compound or worsen these challenges medical cannabis patients already have and are struggling with today. Today, over 250,000 Canadian medical cannabis patients get relief of symptoms from various conditions and illnesses, including pain, headaches, anxiety, sleep disorders, MS, Crohn's disease, and epilepsy, just to name a few, which is why it's of critical importance that the ACMPR medical cannabis system be supported and continue into the future. In crafting Bill C-45, we want to commend the government for recognizing the need to maintain a separate and distinct regulatory approach for medical cannabis, and we want to ensure that this is maintained. Beyond the government's constitutional requirements to provide reasonable access to cannabis for medical purposes, patients have unique considerations that can best be met in a distinct regulatory regime. Moving forward, beyond Bill C-45, it is important that the government prioritizes and adequately supports the needs of patients by addressing their unique requirements. Among these requirements is the need for integrated end-to-end health care where a patient can have a conversation with their doctor all the way through to their pharmacist. Patients must be free to discuss medical cannabis as a treatment option with their primary care physician as they are with any other conditions today, while understanding any potential medical or medication interactions that they may face. In addition to the continuation of mail order today, we believe pharmacies should have the authority to retail medical cannabis, and further product forms should also be made available. Sales and consultation through pharmacies will help ensure that patients across Canada can access their medicine easily and can receive reliable, education on the safe and effective use of medical cannabis from trained healthcare professionals with regulatory oversight. This is not only of significant importance today, but especially in the future as age demographics of our population dramatically change. Very soon, we will have more older Canadians than young, and this brings with it a seismic shift in healthcare needs for this country. You've already heard this morning, but let me underscore from a patient's perspective that affordability of medical cannabis remains an urgent crisis for the majority of patients, as fully 60% of these patients cannot afford their full dose. Insurers rarely cover the cost of medical cannabis, and the majority of patients' expenses are out of pocket. Again, this will become a critical demographic issue as more and more Canadians will be on fixed incomes. Also keep in mind, this is a medicine whose cost is already significantly burdened by HST, and it shouldn't be. Other medicines in Canada are zero-rated and not subject to any tax. And to compound this situation, just this week, the government passed yet another tax for medical cannabis patients, an excise tax, or what is commonly described as a sin tax. To disincentivize the responsible management of someone's medical needs makes absolutely no sense, and applying a sin tax to medicine is completely out of line with our collective moral beliefs and principles as Canadians. It's important to recognize where cannabis tax revenue has been coming from up to this point, and that is medical cannabis patients. Essentially, the government is telling patients it wants them to pay excise and consumption taxes to help pay for education and enforcement for legalization of recreational cannabis. This is an unprecedented approach and wholly inappropriate for patients. Think this through. The government is funding education and enforcement to fight the opioid crisis, but they're not asking legitimate patients to use opioids to pay for those efforts. So why are they asking this of cannabis patients? Finally, on a related topic, affordability is one of the reasons why we also support personal production, and that is to give patients who struggle financially the option of producing their own medicine. I have three main asks today. One is that CFAM supports cannabis research and education initiatives. However, that should not be paid for on the backs of patients who are already carrying significant burdens today. Two, the government should do all it can to facilitate insurance coverage for medical cannabis. This is a big issue and confronts many, many patients today. Finally, remove all taxes for medical cannabis. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Next, we have Hillary Black, BC Compassion Club Society.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I am the founder of the first medical cannabis organization in the country, the BC Compassion Club Society, which was founded in 1997. In the interest of disclosure, I'm also employed with Canopy Growth, but I'm here today in my role as the founder of the Compassion Club. My remarks will focus on prioritizing and protecting critically and chronically ill Canadians through three recommendations. We will ask you to protect Canada's historical medical cannabis institution, the Compassion Club, to bring cannabis in all of its forms and potencies into the regulated market, and to remove the unjust taxes on medical cannabis. I have been publicly, safely, and responsibly retailing cannabis out of a storefront for over 20 years. The Compassion Club is a nonprofit society, and our model is unique. In addition to cannabis therapies, we have a subsidized wellness center. Last year, we provided 3,400 non-cannabis related holistic healthcare appointments, such as counseling and acupuncture and clinical herbalism, to some of Vancouver's most marginalized people, with little or no cost to our 11,000 members. Our clients often have multiple diagnoses, mental health issues, and substance abuse issues. They are falling through the cracks of the healthcare system until we catch them. We have developed the gold standard for medical cannabis education. We know how to maximize benefits, minimize risks, and avoid adverse effects, knowledge that is transferable to the recreational cannabis market. In 2002, I had the honor of testifying before the Senate Committee on Illegal Drugs and hosting that committee for a tour at the Compassion Club. Their report recommended the Compassion Club should be the standard for medical access and patient care across the country. Our model was enshrined into municipal bylaws by the City of Vancouver to encourage the replication of that model. Members of the task force, including the chair, Anne McClellan, visited the Compassion Club, and we are referenced as a model in that report. We worked with patient groups like CFAM to host a special meeting of patients for the task force, and partially as a result of that task force hearing directly from patients, The task force recommended the preservation of the medical system, which is absolutely the right thing to do, to encourage patients to use cannabis with the support of their healthcare professional. I was selected by Senator Nolan, may he rest in peace, to receive the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, acknowledging the work of the Compassion Club for its significant contribution to Canada. But today, the Compassion Club is facing extinction, as we do not fit into the regulatory framework of the ACMPR or this legalization bill. We have a massive responsibility to ensure the health care of our 11,000 members is not interrupted, and we respectfully suggest that you share that responsibility with us. Washington and Colorado have prioritized transitioning long-standing medical cannabis institutions into the regulatory framework, and we should be doing the same. The Compassion Club is a national treasure, and we ask that you recommend that the Compassion Club be given special consideration and protection, and we will work it out with the government and find a way to survive. We have risked arrest for decades, dedicated to patients, inspired by people like Greg Cooper. When I met Greg, he was 22, had severe multiple sclerosis, and could not put on his pants or feed himself until his tremors, muscle spasms, and pain were relieved through both inhaling and ingesting cannabis and potent cannabis products. Dan Hill, who was no longer with us, was diagnosed with HIV, hepatitis C, mental health issues, and substance use issues. He used potent cannabis products as a gateway out of his addictions to heroin, crack cocaine, and alcohol. He moved off the street, into his own apartment, fell in love, and died a happy man. My grandmother, Jean Black, who's 102 in June, she uses a few drops of cannabis extracts in her tea instead of codeine to manage her arthritic pain, and it helped her with the side effects of the intensive radiation she had to heal the tumor in her throat. These are just a few stories of Canadians whose lives have been transformed by cannabis, and I have witnessed thousands of them. And they have asked me today to talk with you about potency and about tax. So there's one really important thing to understand when we're talking about potent cannabis products. Did you know that we have very few cannabinoid receptors in our brainstem? And the brainstem controls cardiac function and respiratory function. And what this means is that cannabis cannot cause death. So when we talk about overdosing on cannabis, it's actually very misleading because the word overdose implies that death is possible. When someone uses too much cannabis, the effects can be very uncomfortable. They can include nausea and vomiting and anxiety, but never death. Potent cannabis products allow patients to consume less plant matter to achieve the required effect and can be more cost-effective. For a recreational consumer, extracts can mean taking one inhalation of an elegant vape pen rather than smoking an entire joint. Potent concentrates, finished edible products, tinctures, topicals, resins, and suppositories must be brought into the legal market as soon as possible. Consumers will continue to access and use these products in an unregulated market. Your concerns will best be addressed by the production, distribution, and education occurring in a regulated market. Potency limits will not achieve the results that you're looking for. So potent cannabis extracts have not been responsible for a single death. Conversely, last year in BC, more people died from opioid overdoses than traffic accidents. One of them was my best friend's 18-year-old daughter. The Compassion Club has acquired tremendous experience with people struggling with substance use issues using cannabis as a harm reduction tool. We have witnessed cannabis being substituted for recreational and prescription opiates, cocaine, alcohol, and even fentanyl. As you know, the opioid crisis is a great public health emergency of our time. This country needs solutions now, and as you have heard, cannabis has great potential. So we implore you to vote yes to Bill C-45 to accelerate the legalization of cannabis in all of its forms and potencies, and to invest in research into the potential role of cannabis as a part of the solution to this crisis. I was raised to believe that as Canadians, we use our power and privilege to protect those who are unable to defend themselves. We stand up for the rights of those who are being mistreated. I'm so disappointed this week that the House of Commons committee decided to maintain the excise tax on medical cannabis. The truth is that I'm ashamed of my country, that we're forcing patients not only to pay a sales tax, but a sin tax on their physician-authorized medicine. Some families are paying hundreds of dollars a month alone. We do not tax medical necessities in this country. So I ask you to please make us proud of our government's compassion and wisdom and remove the tax on physician-authorized medical cannabis. The world is watching us, and together we have an immense responsibility to get this right. We know the harms of prohibition are far greater than the risks of cannabis use. Prohibition laws have disproportionately affected Indigenous people, people of color, and other minority groups. Around the world, families are being torn apart, lives ruined, people jailed, and the futures of young people destroyed. You are a part of righting this great wrong, and I thank you for your diligent work. You can trust the Senate Committee report of 2002. You can trust the legalization task force process and report, and trust your amazing team at Health Canada working its way through these complex issues. So I ask you for three things. Protect Canada's historical medical cannabis institution. Bring cannabis in all of its forms and potencies into the regulated market as soon as possible, and remove the cruel tax on medical cannabis patients. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Finally, we have Kirk Tousaw.
Thank you, Honourable Senators. I'm here as an individual. I'm here as a medical cannabis consumer myself. I use cannabis on a daily basis for chronic pain and have since I was 30 years of age. I'm also here, I'd like to think, as a voice for the hundreds of people I've represented in the criminal and civil courts over the years of working in this field, victims of prohibition that did not deserve to be criminalized for their conduct. With that said, a brief history lesson. 16 years ago, the late progressive conservative Senator Pierre-Claude Nolin chaired the Senate Special Committee on Illegal Drugs, which issued a comprehensive 600-page report on the issue that currently occupies this body's deliberations. How should the Government of Canada deal with the issue of cannabis? I had the privilege of speaking with Senator Nolin many times about this, and he regularly reminded me that he'd come to the issue a staunch opponent of legalization. As a father, he said to me, he was mainly concerned about the impact on his children. Senator Nolin, however, allowed and indeed demanded that the committee use a rigorous review of the evidence to drive its conclusions. And there was much evidence. This Senate study remains one of the most comprehensive analyses of cannabis and cannabis policy ever conducted anywhere in the world. The report began by acknowledging that at its most basic, the discussion is really not about people consuming cannabis. Under prohibition, Canadians consume plenty of cannabis. We grow it, we sell it, and we consume it in vast quantities. As the committee pointed out, the issue is really about whether criminalizing millions of Canadians for those personal choices is good public policy. The committee grounded its analysis in principles that should serve as guides to this body. Good public policy should promote freedom for individuals and society as a whole. The proper role of the state is based on respect for autonomy and individual and societal responsibility. Ultimately, Senator Nolin and the rest of the 9-member committee determined in 2002 that criminalization was bad public policy and concluded, quote, the state of the knowledge supports the belief that for the vast majority of recreational users, cannabis use presents no harmful consequences for physical, psychological, or social well-being in either the short or long term. The committee also concluded that it was prohibition that actually caused the most harm to society. The main social costs of cannabis are a result of public policy choices, primarily its continued criminalization, while the consequences of its use represent a small fraction of the social costs attributable to the use of illegal drugs. Concluding that cannabis prohibition is harmful public policy, the committee recommended legalizing cannabis for Canadians over age 16 and granting amnesty to anyone previously convicted of simple possession. The committee's specific policy suggestion may seem familiar. Quote, the committee recommends that the Government of Canada amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act to create a criminal exemption scheme. This legislation should stipulate conditions for obtaining licenses as well as for producing and selling cannabis, criminal penalties for illegal trafficking and export, and preservations of criminal penalties for all activities falling outside the scope of the exemption scheme. Honourable Senators, this appears to be precisely what Bill C-45 proposes to do, and the Government of Canada should be commended for now moving forward with reforming our cannabis laws. That said, I disagreed then and I disagree now that a criminal law-based approach is appropriate. At most, cannabis should be treated in the same general way we treat alcohol, a much more dangerous substance, a regulatory approach with extremely limited offense provisions. And I dare say that the Senate committee believed that any vestige of a criminal law-based regime should be extremely limited, because one of the report's guiding principles is that, quote, only offenses involving a significant direct danger to others should be matters of criminal law, end quote. In the intervening 16 years, we've learned much more about both the harms of prohibition and the impacts of legalization. We've seen experiments in legalization, both tacit and explicit, at home and abroad. We've had a system of legal access, including legal home production of medical cannabis since 2001 in this country. We've had a system of commercial production and sale for medical purposes since 2014, which now has 300,000 participants. We've had a system of relatively open and widespread dispensary access in many major cities in Canada since 2014, and more limited dispensary access for more than 20 years. You can't walk 10 blocks in the city of Vancouver or downtown Toronto, or for that matter, Hamilton or Victoria or Seattle or Denver or Los Angeles without passing a storefront selling cannabis. These stores are selling, at least in Canada, so-called illicit cannabis openly and safely right now in almost every city and town in British Columbia and in most major population centers in every province in this country. This scares some people, and I understand that. Change is scary, particularly when you aren't familiar with the things that are changing. But I also understand that the evidence is clear that we have not seen and will not see the types of harms that so many seem to fear. Chaos does not reign in Vancouver. Every day you see people walking past dispensaries, and some going in the shop, just like they do every other store. 1 year after this change is implemented, I suspect we will mostly be wondering what all the fuss was about. I do have 4 specific recommendations. First, I want to reiterate my objection to a criminal law approach because such an approach will continue to have significant negative external consequences, such as the continued disparate enforcement against visible minorities and those with less economic means. I hope that we move beyond this approach swiftly. But at the very least, we must be expunging criminal records for simple possession so that our previous bad laws are not anchors weighing down our fellow citizens' life prospects. We should also remove all criminal penalties in C-45 associated with simple personal possession and production of cannabis. On that point, secondly, I want to emphasize that lawful personal gardens are critical aspects of this reform. Allowing commercial production and sale, but criminalizing people, Canadians, with penalties of up to 14 years in prison who want to grow the exact same plant for themselves at home turns the point of legalization on its head. Legalization should and must be about not criminalizing individual Canadians for cannabis. The development of a vibrant industry will of necessity follow. Third, and as a parent of 4 children under 18, this comes from my heart. We must not criminalize young people in our pursuit of our laudable goals of trying our best to keep them safe and give them the tools they need to make responsible choices. We've tried the criminal approach. It isn't working now, and as the Senate committee determined, it is actually the single most significant source of harm from cannabis. A criminal penalty of up to 14 years in prison for a 19-year-old that shares a joint with her 17-year-old cousin is abhorrent and morally insupportable. Fourth, as we implement these changes, we must be looking for ways to transition the existing underground cannabis economy out of the shadows and into the light. This change is scary for them, too. Most, 95% of the domestic industry, are not involved with criminal gangs or violence in any way. I've represented hundreds of these folks over the years. They are small farmers, small shopkeepers, and people that love this plant. They are also a rich source of knowledge and experience, and let's be very blunt. If we don't bring them into the fold, many will likely to continue to operate outside of it. That is not good public policy. Finally, I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to address this critical issue. I also want to thank Canada for taking this step and bringing in legalization 1.0. It is not perfect, but it is an important first step. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And that completes our 3 panelist